All right, let's talk structure in regards to poetry. A lot of the same things kind of transfer over from structure with prose. For example, sequence of things, how things are ordered, the ideas of flash forwards, flash backwards, all those techniques can still be talked about when you're talking about the structure of a poem, okay? But the biggest difference is that poems can kind of fit into what are called different poetic forms. So when we're talking about structure, there's just a few more terms that might pop up in your multiple choice, or ways that you can analyze structure based on that poetic form. So the first thing is to talk about some terminology. First off, a verse is a line of a poem. So one single line is called a verse. It's not inappropriate to refer to them as lines because they are numbered, but the appropriate language would be to refer to a verse. The next term is stanza, which is like a paragraph, or, for lack of a better word, a chunk of the poem. In this case, it would be inappropriate to analyze a poem and talk about a paragraph because poems aren't written in paragraphs, they are written in stanzas. So verse or line is fine, but when we're talking about those pieces of a poem, we want to refer to stanza, not paragraph, okay? But that's just kind of how you can think of it in terms of what a stanza is. The next three terms are often kind of used in the multiple choice, so I just want you to be familiar with them. And they're all really talking about similar things, just slightly different. So for example, a couplet is two lines in a row. A tercet is 3 lines. And a quatrain is 4 lines. And obviously it goes on and on and on. But those, I think, are the most commonly referred to ones. So for example, they might ask you about a poet's use of a couplet in your multiple choice section, and they are referring to the 2 lines that they provide for you. You can also talk about why are 2 lines paired in an analysis, and that would be a structural analysis as well. So this is just kind of like the basic language of structure for poetry. And like I said, the biggest thing is to know that a line is a verse, a paragraph or chunk is a stanza, and that when they're using words like couplet, tercet, and quatrain, they're talking about consecutive lines, obviously with a couplet being 2, tercet 3, and quatrain 4. The next part of your notes is really more independent, because really it's just a matter of looking up these different poetic forms. So I've tried to keep it as simple as possible, but in your notes I'd like you to define and find a sample of each of the following poetic forms, okay? It's very easy, guys. It's a simple Google search and they'll tell you what a ballad is, and then they'll provide you examples too. I just want you to have a place in your notes where you have kind of a glossary of these different poetic forms, but I definitely think you can do that independently. So the first one is a ballad, and then I'd like you to look up an Italian sonnet and an English sonnet. They are slightly different, but they're both sonnets. Then a villanelle, a limerick, a sestina, an epigram or epigraph, a haiku, an elegy, an ode, a free verse poem, and a parody form. So these are the most commonly cited poetic forms that are on the different multiple choice passage sections. So in your notes, I'd like you, like I said, define it and then find a sample that you can have as a reference when we get kind of going into our poetic analysis. So go ahead, pause the video here. I do have a little bit that I'm going to come back to at the end, but take a minute and go through and define and find samples of those different poetic forms. Now, the next thing to talk about after you've looked up those poetic forms, I hope, is to talk about how do you analyze a poetic form, because you can't really just write an analysis saying this is a sonnet. That's just an identification, not an analysis. Remember, analysis is asking why did the poet choose to use a sonnet. So At the bottom here, I have the same things I've kind of been talking about in our other analysis sections. They might be using that form for a particular meaning. For example, a limerick, as you know, is something that's kind of sing-songy and rhymey. If they want that kind of innocent, childish feel to it, they might use a limerick form. To evoke emotion, for example, if a poet writes an elegy, it's definitely going to evoke more somber feelings generally, but you could do an analysis if a poet kind of creates a humorous elegy as well, and that would be an analysis of the emotion that it evokes. And then emphasis, you could talk about how a haiku being so short, there is emphasis on a very targeted item. So those are all still applicable here when we're talking analysis of poetic form, but there's also two more, which are up here. The first one is for the witty factor. Now, oftentimes poetic form will be used kind of ironically, like we talked about with figurative language. For example, if you use something very formal, like a sonnet, but you're talking about something silly, like a baby's smelly diaper. I don't know why I thought of that, but I did. But that kind of juxtaposition of something kind of silly with something really formal would demonstrate humor, irony, which is kind of a way of analyzing wit, or what the why the author is using that witty approach. The next one, for more older poems, I would say pretty generally, is the analyzing the use of tradition. So once upon a time, if you've ever seen Dead Poets Society, poetry was kind of written as a challenge to the poet. For example, a sonnet was a common form because the poet had to figure out how to make it rhyme, to fit the structure, to use the right meter, and all of those things had to fit to achieve this poem. So there was a lot of challenge with that. And so that tradition started with people really testing their knowledge of the English language, and it kind of became a brag factor, I guess, back when people cared more than they do now. But you could analyze then how the author fits the structure and why. You can also use this, there's often modern poetry that will align to a sonnet structure or something, and there might be a reason, or there might be the potential to analyze, why is this poem about the internet using the sonnet structure, or why is this poem about technology in a short haiku format? So you could talk about how it fits the model, and that would be, and then your analysis would be, why does it fit that model? So I hope that kind of walks you through how you can analyze the poetic form. When you do a poetry analysis, if you recognize a poetic form, you can certainly analyze, and then, like I said, see if it's for wit, for tradition, for meaning, emotion, or emphasis, to kind of determine why the poet made that choice.